Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my Worlds 2025 quarterfinals day number 4 overview and analysis video. It's the final quarterfinals video that we are putting out here on this channel, and by the end of this video, we're going to know our top 4 teams at Worlds. We know 3 of the 4, of course, from the previous days, but this is the biggest one. In my opinion, this is the best quarterfinals matchup that we got in terms of the draw, and I'm so excited to see how it ends up breaking down. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. Always curious and always interested to know you guys' thoughts and opinions, especially if they differ from mine down below. But quick plugs, again, we've covered everything at Worlds up until this point. We've covered every single game that both of these two teams have played domestically all year long as well for the LPL and the LCK. And so if you want to check out any of that content, it's of course on the channel. And we previewed this particular matchup in my quarterfinals primer video. I still highly suggest you check that out, even if there isn't, a lot of relevance. There still is later tournament relevance in terms of my thoughts and opinions in those matchups. We will be doing more of an in-depth breakdown in terms of the semifinals preview as well on this channel, but of course, with there not really being any time in between the quarterfinals and the semifinals, that definitely is a video that I think will get more of my immediate thoughts in. But that's going to do it for the preamble. Let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I talked about before, this is the final quarterfinals matchup, which means that the semifinals will be, shown to us. We will know who is playing in the semifinals by the end of this video, and we can really start to get into, okay, who's favorited there, and what does that mean for what World Finals could look like in 2025, but that will be saved for the end of the video. Most of today will be spent talking about the series we got, so let's kick it off. Let's preview it. You already see it up on your screen. This is a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Anyone's Legend and the number 4 seed from the LCK in T1. These two teams have had, I would say, opposite roads to get here in terms of how things broke down. T1 for basically 95-ish% of this year was better than Anyone's Legend, although both of them kind of peaked in the spring split, I would say, all things considered, in terms of their relevance and in terms of being able to, compete with the best teams in the world. AL, of course, being able to make the Esports World Cup final, and then of course you have both of these teams making the final 3 at MSI, but T1 was able to get the better of AL at the tournament that quite frankly mattered more. And so, it definitely is one of those things where both of these teams have been good and consistent all year long. However, their tournaments have certainly not been the same in their way of qualifying for the tournaments. Their luck in qualifying for the tournaments has not been the same either. Anyone's Legend comes in as the number 2 seed from the LPL despite not making the finals in the summer split because they had more championship points than Top Esports, a team that has already qualified for the semifinals. But at Worlds, they've been sensational. They were one of the only 2 3-0 teams in terms of series in the Swiss stage. As you guys know, they ended up going 3-0 in terms of series score, and they only lost one game against CFO, which obviously CFO was an okay team. People continue to devalue how good that team is, but Anyone's Legend has really shown up to this tournament. Specifically, I think you're looking at players like Tarzan and Kyle that have been excellent so far at Worlds. Kyle, for me, was the single best player in the Swiss stage of this tournament. Now, that doesn't always mean anything going into the quarterfinals. Last year, I probably would have told you that was Scout for LNG, who very quickly got eliminated in the quarterfinals. And then, Owner was the other player, maybe, that you could have discussed. But really, I think Scout was kind of the star of the Swiss stage, and that didn't work out. We've seen that in the past as well. It doesn't always translate that when you're one of the best players in the Swiss stage. Even someone like Doggo, who you could consider one of the stars of the Swiss stage here, just wasn't good enough to be able to get past KT Rolster, didn't win a single game in that series. Kyle needs to continue that form from the Swiss stage and carry it over here into the quarterfinals if this team really wants any chance of being able to win this. I will say I do kind of believe in the fact that he's going to be able to do that. I've always believed in Kyle as a player, and I think he's looked good against T1 in his limited appearances in the past, when you're talking not only about this year on Anyone's Legend, but when he was in the LCK, when he was playing for Sandbox. I thought he always played relatively well into T1, so hopefully he can keep his head on about him in the biggest series of his life up until this point and make it worth it. But Tarzan is, of course, the other player for Anyone's Legend that simply has to step up. He has been incredibly good at this tournament, so much so that people have been calling me a Tarzan hater for keeping this guy out of the top 10 players players at Worlds video, and the fact that I've turned into a Tarzan hater, like me of all people, is like genuinely insane, but I'm happy to see that people are jumping on board with the fact that he has an argument for being the best jungler in the world. My only, I guess, reservation here is that it's very easy to forget just how inconsistent Tarzan was domestically. He would have these games like he did in the Swiss stage where he would pop off and dominate, but he would also have games where he wasn't particularly consistent and where he wasn't exactly, you know, pushing his team forward, where he had so much responsibility because the rest of this team is kind of average, which we will get into, at least at a global level, that he had to be a superstar every game or this team wasn't going to be able to win, and that just put a lot of weight and pressure on his performances and made them much more inconsistent. That's got to change, and that's got to be able to maintain from what it was in the Swiss stage where he just was good. Hopefully he can continue to be that best jungler in the world type of talent that we know he can be at a top-end level, but I'm worried about the rest of this team. Flandre into Doran, I think, is a pretty okay matchup for AL. I think Doran is likely going to take it relatively easy in laning phase. That should mean that Flandre should be able to generate some leads on the top side and get some gold for himself. I just don't think Flandre has been as consistent of a team fighter, but he's gotten much better, I would say, across this year. Both of these players love to play tanks. We'll see how that's operated in the draft phase. You have Shanks going into Faker. That's one where, like, mechanically, yeah, you would definitely favor Shanks, but like at Worlds, I'm definitely not favoring Shanks over Faker. It seems like Faker's world buff activated at the end of the Swiss stage there when they qualified over Koi, when he absolutely dominated that series. We'll see if that carries into the quarterfinals. Hint, it likely will. Again, haven't seen the games yet as I'm recording this intro, but I just would be surprised if Faker didn't start playing like an absolute monster like he always does. The Faker Worlds buff is legit. And then Hope is like the one player on this team that I think is clearly worse than his opposition. I think he's just worse than Gumayusi, who's been excellent at this tournament. So AL really need to get those performances out of Tarzan and Kyle if they want to pick up a victory. But for T1, their pathway is even foggier, right? Like, this is a team that qualified as the 4th seed because they lost to Hanwha Life and then randomly had to go up against Gen.G in the lower bracket because they decided to lose to KT in the upper bracket and go as the 4th seed. But they've gotten more opportunities to play games. That being said, the games at Worlds so far have not really looked all that good. They've gotten really easy matchups for the most part, obviously drawing, you know, teams like Gen.G in the 1-1 section. That's not ideal, but they lose to CFO. They're, you know, at least pressured a little bit by 100 Thieves in their 2-0 win over them. And once again, they're pressured again by Koi in the 2-2 matchup. And so these are not teams that T1 should be struggling with. And it is concerning that this is the first time in Worlds history that T1 has lost more than one game in the original stage of Worlds, whether that was groups back in, you know, before this Swiss stage existed or Swiss stage. They never lost more than one game in that phase, that first phase of Worlds, and yet they lost 2. They lost to CFO and they lost to Gen.G. And so you're hoping that they're going to be able to rebound, but something does seem a bit off with this team right now. That being said, my prediction was T1, even though I gave this series about a 50-50. I think Anyone's Legend absolutely has been better at Worlds up until this point, but how do you bet against T1 in the quarterfinals? It's impossible to feel like this team is the underdog. And I know T1 fans love to make themselves out to be like, oh, we're the underdogs, we're underestimated. There's no way you could possibly make this team the underdog in any situation. They are the New York Yankees of League of Legends. They are almost always going to be favored regardless of if they've earned it or not. But we'll see if they can step up. Again, I think they have players that can really, really dominate their opposition, but it's a big series for players like Oner and players like Gumayusi. Those are the two that I think really need to be on their A game today. So we'll see how it breaks down. Again, I gave it a 50-50, even though I am favoring T1, maybe a 51-49, because it's really hard to say, or to throw out all of the tape that we've seen at this tournament up until this point, but you got to believe in the T1 magic. We'll see if it activates, and we'll especially see if it activates here in game number 1 as we go game by game. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And yeah, this is the T1 Worlds buff activating, just them being better in terms of their fights. Was their macro good? Not really throughout this game. They were just losing in the early game in terms of resources. There was 0 kills, I think, for the first 10 to 12-ish minutes of this game. And yet T1 was like 1.5k gold down. And that's because AL did a great job of being able to utilize their early strength in the top lane and in the bot lane to be able to generate pressure for the team. The problem is they could not win a fight to save their lives throughout this entire game. Every single 5v5, 4v4, 3v3, whatever, all of it ended up going in favor of T1. And I think that was a really, really good sign for T1, because honestly, my biggest concern with this team is that they're just not going to have the hands or the firepower to make up for the fact that right now they're inconsistent in the early game, right? it does just kind of seem like that is who they are. Like they're going to be an inconsistent team. In the early game, they were like that against 100 Thieves. They were like that against Movistar Koi. But if their hands are good enough to be able to win fights anyways, despite being down resources against a team as talented as anyone's legend, then they're going to be fine. Like the T1 that we saw domestically absolutely is still here. And so, happy to see them be able to pick up that game number 1 win. And a lot of it's got to be given to the back of Faker once again. I mean, we talked about the Faker Worlds buff coming in. That was the case in this game number 1 at the very least in terms of how he ended up performing. Those seismic shoves were always on point. His macro was perfect in this game. He can sometimes be a little bit out of position. I think he gets a little bit too much credit for like, the Faker mind virus, the global taunt that goes in where everybody's constantly trying to kill Faker. I talk about this a lot on the channel with the LCK videos, but Faker is very, very greedy in terms of his positioning, constantly pushing way farther forward than he's really allowed to in a lot of situations. And that's why teams feel the need to try and collapse on him because of how greedy he's positioned. He's just good enough to be able to get away with it. That wasn't really happening in this game. He was basically perfect in terms of the macro and the things he was putting down, or like the way he was playing the map, I should say, that really ended up, opening things up. And obviously the team fights were excellent from him. He's a great Taliyah player. I saw some people being like, oh, why'd they give him Taliyah? How many champions do you have to ban against Faker? I mean, like you already banned Bard and Nico because you have to take away playmakers from Keria. He still got the other one, by the way, on R5 with the Rakan, but you have to ban Azir. That's the other one. You yourself banned Orianna, and so it's just one of those things where there aren't enough bans in the game to take out Faker. You know what I mean? Like it's not going to happen. Rest of the team was still very good. Gumayusi continues to be excellent in these team fights. I think he's a bit underrated in terms of how he plays these 5v5s. Really was much better than Hope in this game, which we will get into. Doran was basically unkillable down the stretch. I think Oner utilized his kit well. This is how you maximize Pantheon in his current state at Worlds. I continue to say that this guy's combat power and his combat strength is just significantly worse than people think it is. But if you're using him as, point and click CC to set up a Varus and a Taliyah to be able to actually be the damage dealers, that all of a sudden becomes significantly more viable. I thought his macro this game was very good. And then Keria was solid as well. Some great engages, some great disengages. I think that's really where it came down to. A lot of the early fights, the Rakan was invaluable in terms of just pressing R and making sure that T1 didn't get obliterated at the start of fights. But it just was a good game from T1. You can criticize their early game macro, but at the end of the day, they never lost a fight. They were always in control. They were always around objectives. They got Soul and Elder and Baron. Like, there's not really a lot to actually criticize here. It's just a strong start to the series for T1. And for AL, there are some frustrating points, I think, here in terms of how they played the game. Hope for me was just useless in this one. He stud of the game on the Ezreal. How much of this is his gameplay and how much of this is playing Ezreal into Sion and Pantheon and all of these champions that are going to take 0 damage from this champion? That's up to you to decide. But what I can say is that Hope was bad. Like, he was not effective in his role of being a damage dealer on Ezreal. He even was given an early game lead, as you should be able to get as Ezreal Braum into Varus Rakan. He just didn't do anything with it throughout the rest of the game, which was very frustrating. Flandra, Tarzan, I think they also ran into their own set of struggles. Flandra was basically useless in this game after taking an early tower. Again, an early gold lead in lane that ended up translating to absolutely nothing because he could never get in fights, and you can't really take Sion out of the game. Tarzan blows the LPL Kiana game here in game number 1 and just can't quite ever find an avenue in. I don't necessarily think he played terrible, but he wasn't really effective. Again, by the time he was playing aggressive enough to actually capitalize on Kiana's strengths as a champion, they were just too far down in the game to be able to pilot it. The one player that I think actually did play phenomenal here was Shanks in the mid lane. He was doing as much damage as he possibly could, ducking in and out of fights on the Rise, doing the Rise things. I think he had a really strong game. I just don't think it really ended up mattering in the end. So AL now down 0-1 in this series, and it's really, really hard for me to not feel demoralized by this if you are like looking for an AL victory, because you're sitting in a spot where, yes, AL was better in this Swiss stage, but they are the LPL going into T1, which is already a nightmare. T1's in the quarterfinals, which they've never lost in the history of this organization. If they get to quarters, they make it out of quarters. That has always been the case for T1, and it just feels like they have this magic on their side. AL have their backs up against the wall for sure now. They have to win this game number 2. You can't go down 0-2 to a team like T1 at this tournament. But if T1 can activate that Worlds buff, keep it going, and get that 2-0 series lead, they could be looking at a date with Destiny with yet another LPL team in the semifinals. Are they going to get that lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series here at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a back and forth on our hands. This game was Chaotic. I think that is the best way to possibly describe what ended up going down. This felt like an easy win for AL in the early and in the mid game, but one very ill-timed blue buff invade made things very complicated at the end of this game. It didn't really matter. AL ended up winning the fights that mattered. They ended up winning around Dragon, and at that point, they were just too far ahead. They got Baron, and even a neutral game that probably should not have been neutral in any facet turns into a game that they can, snowball into a pretty clean victory, all things considered. One massive mistake and ace aside, everything was solid here. For T1, just not really a draft that I like. Like, this is so greedy. This entire game is so greedy from them. There's really no other word to describe what T1 was. If chaos is what describes AL, greed is what describes T1 here for game number 2 and how they played. This is a G2 draft. It's Anivia mid. It's Draven AD carry. It's Nautilus first pick with Poppy already showing. It's diving Mbessa under tower over and over again. Like, there's just so many things that ended up going very weird in this game for T1 that I think are just gigantic mental errors where they have to feel like they are so much better than their opposition that they can get away with it. This is the exact same kind of stuff that they were doing against 100 Thieves that really ended up landing them in trouble in that series, at least in game number 1, where a better team could have capitalized. Well, here is a better team. Here is 100 Thieves except better in anyone's legend. And yeah, you can't really be making those same mistakes. They're going to run away with the game, even if they did try and donate it back to you. Tarzan in particular with a very bad invade on blue buff, like I said, around the end of the game here. You can't really get away with what happened in the early game here and expect to win the game. So a lot of greed coming in from T1, but for AL, player of the game kind of has to go to Flandre. I know the KDA isn't exactly the sexiest thing in the entire world. Like, KDA wise, they should go to like Hope or even like a Kyle or a Shanks in terms of how things broke down. I thought Tarzan was very good outside of the major issue, but really Flandre was the main character in game number 2 here. He was the one getting dove over and over again on the top side, constantly trading 1-for-1, and then hitting every ultimate that he needed to in the back end of the game. Even one of his like more inexcusable deaths where he just gets caught on a side wave with a teleport coming in and it gets blocked off by Faker's Anivia, isn't able to land the ultimate for a counter kill and gets like 3v1 on the top side. That turns into Guma and Keria getting caught for no reason in that same jungle, and then the team taking mid lane with Rift Herald and then taking Dragon on the bottom side of the map. And so it ended up being a super gold positive play for Flandre in the end anyways, and it was just a very good game, I would say, from him on the Mbessa. This was a very notable, I think, kind of way to play weak side, and this is truly like the weak side masterclass in terms of how to execute a game like this. So credit to him. He's been better than Doran through the first couple of games. We'll see if that can keep up. At least in lane, that's definitely been consistent. Rest of the team was also solid. Kyle had an excellent game here on the Poppy. I don't know if he's going to get enough credit. He would have been my player of the game outside of Flandre. I think that champion in general did most of the work, and so I'm not necessarily going to say that he was an absolute monster, but he was hitting his ultimates. The W was very valuable throughout this entire game. There's really not a lot of criticism that I can give to the way he ended up playing. Maybe he overstepped at a couple of points, but that kind of was the case for everybody on AL, and I think in the 5v5s, he was basically reading the mind of everybody, specifically like Flandre ulting, Shanks ulting on top of Flandre, and then Tarzan and Hope following up perfectly with a ton of damage, Kyle being there for disengage. Like, it was just really well played in the 5v5s. Tarzan was excellent in the team fights as well, as was Shanks, but Tarzan, of course, does have that one moment that almost threw the entire game away and potentially the entire series away for AL, so I couldn't exactly consider him for player of the game because of that alone. Hope really team fought well in this game. I think he was much better at playing with the rest of his team than Gumayusi was, who was isolated a lot of the time on the Draven. So credit to AL. Nice win here in game number 2. Necessary win in game number 2. If you go down 0-2 to T1 at Worlds, you're cooked. Like, there's just nothing else to say. And for T1, I've already kind of gone into it, but I mean, this game is just, it's one of those ego check games where you just have to play different than this. I'm not even saying this draft is unplayable, although I think there are certain decisions in this draft that make it more difficult. Specifically, the Nautilus on R1 into Poppy, I think is just crazy, like a truly insane pick. I think, Draven and Anivia can work in theory. I think it's very difficult to make this work, and Guma would really have to get fed early. He even got a cash out pretty early on into this game. I want to say around 10 or 11 minutes into this game. It just never really mattered. That guy was isolated entirely from his team, constantly being taken advantage of by the great vision coverage that anyone's legend and Tarzan in particular had throughout a majority of this game. That's always been something Tarzan has excelled at. Outside of that, Faker's dud of the game for me. This Anivia was almost entirely useless. Really, the only thing this champion did throughout this mid game was put up a wall a couple of times to trap somebody in to trade 4-for-1 instead of 4-for-0. Like, it really was not a good game from Faker. Part of it was the champion. Part of it was that he was out of position. That teleport into the topside jungle that just instantly gets caught out and he instantly dies. That is a game-losing kind of play, and he wasn't very effective in side lanes either. Didn't have a very good laning phase, ended up not flashing Flandra's ultimate in the mid lane and got comboed down early on in the laning phase when the Ambessa came down for a gank. Like, just a bad game, I would say, from Faker. He gives and he takes. You know, the game number 1 was great, the game number 2 not so much. I imagine he will rebound just fine. Doran has been completely outclassed in lane. He had an advantage in this game, but that's because he received so many resources and then did basically nothing with it. In the late game, Oner had no tempo on the map. Like, it just was one of those games for T1 that I think, you know, I'm not going to read too much into it because I think that the adjustments and the things that need to change are really easy to spot, and I imagine they will make that going into a game number 3. But now you're staring down the barrel of a best of 3, which basically anybody can win, especially at this level. Two teams that I thought were very even going into this series have proven themselves to be even through the first 2 games, but one team will be taking a lead and by proxy control of this entire series in game number 3. You guys know I think this is the most important game of a series when tied up at 1 apiece. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1. And we are now on series point. T1 against the LPL. Their backs are up against the wall. Can they make it out? I guess that's the question, right? T1, they're going to sit there and criticize Draft. That's what fans do. They've gotten robotically accustomed to saying T1 lost, it must be Draft. And while I do think Draft was a bit of a problem in this game, and I'm going to go into some of the things that could have been optimized a bit more, this is far from the worst Draft at this tournament, and it's far from the worst Draft T1 has had at this tournament. I think this game is imminently playable in terms of the champions that they drafted for themselves. I think we saw that in the fact that they had a 2,500 gold lead in this game. In the mid game, like at 20 minutes into this game, they had a 2,500 gold lead. They just couldn't hang on because it was individual player problems. Like, they were making mistakes. This was a very sloppy game from T1, and AL was more than happy to clean up on those mistakes and, quite frankly, just team fight better down the stretch, which again kind of was the overall thesis of game number 1 in favor of T1. So it's cool to see AL fight back here. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Tarzan in the jungle. Tarzan was really good in this game, man. If you want to criticize him for looking a little bit shaky at the end of game 2, even though his team fighting was great on the Wukong and he did everything he was supposed to as an engage threat for that team, if you want to criticize the fact that he almost threw the entire game at blue buff, I understand. All goodwill has been forgiven. Like, all of it is forgiven now with this game number 3 performance where this guy was an absolute menace on the Jarvan. You know, I continue to laugh in the face of people who just assumed Jarvan was going to be unpickable for the rest of this tournament just because, you know, a couple of bad teams, it went 0-8 when bad teams were playing him and teams were playing him in bad situations where they didn't really know how to execute dives. Like, yeah, once the good teams started playing this guy regularly, he was going to start winning again, just like he did domestically. Nothing has changed about this champion's effectiveness. He still is an absolute monster. The mobility and the range that he is able to offer in terms of engage patterns is basically only matched by Vi, but I think Jarvan is significantly tankier and significantly more reliable right now than Vi is in terms of going in with her ultimate, which we saw this game, you know, seeing Tarzan versus Oner in the jungle matchup, but it's Tarzan's willingness to pull the trigger at the exact right time and to not pull the trigger at the wrong time that ended up really separating him. That engage around Baron after they started it up, pushing down that mid lane tower, so gorgeous. It was snap quick, about as decisive and immediate as you could ever ask for in that situation, and it won them the game. Obviously, the follow-up from the rest of the team was great, and we'll get into some of the other pieces down the stretch here for AL that I think performed well, but this was Tarzan's game. He ran the rift, he was able to control every objective, and, you know, when teams wanted to go for them, and I think his team fighting was perfect, this was the Tarzan that everybody was hyping up, and I'm so happy to see it, you know, really come out here in what is maybe the most important game of his entire career up until this point. As for the rest of this team, Shanks had an awesome game here on the Yone, and you know what? Shanks is playing a really strong series so far. Even in the game that they lost, he was the strength, I would say, of AL, and he was very good in both game 2 and game 3. You know, LPL mid laners, like especially the ones that were questioned going into this tournament, they are really kind of making a name for themselves right now on these melee carries. You had Cream popping off and winning player of the series for me yesterday against G2, and Shanks has been excellent so far in this series, and this Yone really fits into his own individual play style. If they're going to continue to find ways to be able to fit champions like this into their drafts consistently. I don't know, man. Like, that's a terrifying prospect. Hope was very good after the early game, got Blitzcrank hooked in the mid lane, and after that, never really made a gigantic mistake throughout the rest of the game, but was overall, playing Jhin, doing Jhin things. Kyle had a really nice Bard this game in terms of the ults and the engage angles he found. Sometimes I would consider the Bard a negative in the fact that Sylas got to steal Bard ultimate a lot throughout this game, which is never really good to try and play into, but I think Kyle did a good enough job of being able to utilize his strengths as a champion to his team's advantages rather than, letting Faker kind of dominate that in terms of stealing the ultimate and making more of a use of it. I think Kyle was better with the ults this game than Faker was, if that makes sense. Flandre wasn't very good on the Aurora. This guy has not been all that great outside of tanks throughout a majority, or at least bruisers throughout a majority of this year, but they didn't really need him to pop off. He was mostly there for bait throughout a majority of the game, and Tarzan and Shanks and Kyle, they were more than happy to capitalize. This was a great game number 3 from AL. Even though they were down quite a bit of gold, they fought back, they won the fights that they needed to, and they got the win to go up 2-1 in this series. And for T1 on the other side, this was very sloppy. Like, the gameplay here was very sloppy. Again, I get it. Like, I understand where people are coming from, and I'm sure that there are going to be some comments on this video that are already saying that I'm undervaluing, how bad T1's drafts were, or there were comments from people who, commented before they watched the video that talked about how bad T1's drafts were. I get it, man. T1 doesn't draft well. I don't think this game was a draft problem. I think that this is a game that is winnable for this team. I think people constantly jump on this idea that Ziggs is not a good bot laner when we've seen it decimate the other 2 series that it's been played in the quarterfinals up until this point. And I get it, it's not always Gumayusi's playstyle to play like Ziggs, but he can do it. He's done it domestically before, and I think Gumayusi's problem this game is that his positioning was that of a bronze player, which we will get into. He's dud of the game. He was awful in terms of how he played this game out. I don't think that was Ziggs' fault. I think that was Gumayusi's fault, and I am going to blame him for that, because at the very least they felt comfortable enough to pick it for him. But the rest of the team, I think, also made some mistakes. Keria wasn't nearly as effective on this big playmaking Blitzcrank as you would want in a series like this. Like, they've been very proactive, AL, that is, at taking away a lot of Keria's big, playmaking type of champions, things like Nico and, of course, picking the Bard away here for Kyle in this game, and Keria feels like he has to kind of go down the pecking order a bit to find a playmaker that can actually still be aggressive, and that's the Blitzcrank, and he just didn't make enough use of it in this game. How many consequential hooks can you genuinely name that happened? There just really weren't all that many. There were a few in the early game, but especially as we got later and later, he could really only find angles onto the front line, and that only really helped AL. Oner got completely out-jungled in terms of tempo. Faker did not have a particularly good game in terms of the fights that he played. I don't think it was as bad as the Anivia game, but I think for the most part he wasn't really doing damage, and that's a bit of a problem for Sylas. Doran was, ironically enough, probably the best player on the team here in terms of being able to do things in fights, but even he was more so an afterthought in terms of how things broke down. AL just was ahead of them and on the curve. Like, even when they were down in gold, it felt like they were stronger, which is a problem for T1. This team has not looked up to their own standards so far at the World Championships, and it is now or never. They are 1 game away from going out in the quarterfinals for the first time ever as an organization. Are they going to be able to win Game 4 and push us to a Silver Scrapes Game 5, or is AL going to do the impossible as an LPL team and take down T1 at Worlds? Well, the winner of game number 4 was T1. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series here at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. I feel pretty good about the 50-50 prediction at this point, because it really is anyone's series to take. This is maybe the most dominant game of the series up until this point. That kind of is the way that things go. Typically in these best of 5s, is that game 4 is often not particularly stressful. It's weird how that ends up breaking down, how common that trend ends up being, especially if you hit a Silver Scrapes Game 5, but that's the world we lived in here. AL did try and fight their way back into this game, but their comp was never going to allow them to play this game in the later part, and you know what? Their AD carry wasn't either, so a lot of things just kind of going against anyone's legend in this game. There was an Astro gap in terms of the bot lane, and we talked about this as kind of being something to watch out for in this series. Gumayusi was on fire on Kai'Sa in this game. He's player of the game easily. I know that there are T1 fans that criticize Gumayusi's Kai'Sa And while I do understand kind of where they're coming from in terms of, like, he's obviously much more of an early game player, he's somebody who does want to try and dominate lane, and when he does play weak side, he wants to do it on other things. Like, Kai'Sa's not exactly the kind of champion that he operates the best on. His Kai'Sa's never been terrible, and I don't understand where this reputation seems to have come from. He was obviously great in this game. He astro-gapped Hope. I mean, truly, it was like a 7k gold difference between Guma and Hope alone by the end of the game. It was actually just indescribable how bad Hope ended up playing this game and how much Gumayusi was able to capitalize and really get fed off of that here. So I do want to give Guma a lot of credit. I've been very vocal at this tournament. I will continue to be vocal about the fact that I think Gumayusi has been T1's best player throughout this year and really throughout a lot of this tournament. I think he continues to step up when it matters. Their backs were up against the wall and they relied on their hyper carry ADC to get them across the finish line, and he gave them that. He is very quickly becoming kind of the face of T1 to me in terms of how they play the game. I know he's not. Like, Faker is the face of T1, but like Guma, I think, has defined their playstyle for the past 2 years in terms of how he breaks down, and I think he would fit in basically any situation. This guy is ridiculous, and if he can step up again in game number 5, like, T1 is going to be in a really, really great spot to move on to the semifinals. Faker as well, I think, getting Victor. We talked about Victor a bit in the Genji Hanwha Life matchup where the Victor was drafted in a pretty bad spot, but Chovy had basically been unbeatable on Victor, and we were like, oh, you know, that's something that he dominated everybody on domestically. Well, let's not forget that it was Chovy and Faker that were dominating on Victor at the beginning of the year, like especially during the spring split, where both of them just kind of felt unbeatable on those champions. It was those two that really separated themselves when playing a lot of Victor in the mid lane, and he gets it again here, and we'll talk about the LeBlanc on the other side, which I really just hate in a do-or-die game number 4. Faker had way more of an impact on the game as a whole because he never really felt pressured to have to make plays in the same way that Shanks had to make plays in this game. I think the carry duo of T1 absolutely stepped up. Keria is a part of that as well. Gumayusi doesn't have nearly as easy of a time if Keria is not only doing really well in lane, but also out of lane with the Pop Blossoms and being a playmaker. They had banned out the Neeko regularly from T1 throughout this series. I do not know why that changed now that all of these other options are off the board. You've already taken away things like Rakan and Blitzcrank, and yet now you feel is the time to leave Neeko up on blue side for T1. It just feels like a very, very weird draft adaptation for anyone's legend, but Keria definitely made the most of it. Owner was fine on the Nocturne. I think this champion is just not all that useful as these games go later. I think Tarzan was more valuable, but he also made significantly more mistakes, and so Owner was a part of things, but not really a part of things. Doran was also solid on the Ornn, but really this was a carry game from T1. They relied on Gumayusi and his gigantic gold lead to really get them across the finish line, and he was more than happy to be a bright lights merchant, if you will. And then for AL on the other side, come on, man. Like, how do I even start this conversation without talking about Hope? Like, there's no other thing to discuss here. This is probably the worst game of his entire career. I don't think that's really all that up for debate. This is one of the worst international AD carry performances I've ever seen. Like, it really is just bad in every way. He was playing Corki and wasn't poking. He was stepping up and instantly dying. He was valking forward and doing no damage. There's literally no excusable trait for Hope in this game. Like, I just can't even begin to describe what happened. This is a guy who, he's one of the few players on this team who actually does have a lot of international experience, who's been to the semifinals of Worlds before with JD Gaming, and yet here he is just looking completely out of his element. Gumayusi embarrassed him in this game in lane, and then Hope was even worse out of lane. Like, it really is just a performance that cannot happen in a closeout game against T1. He has to be better going into game number 5, because if he plays anything like he played here in game number 4, it's unwinnable for AL. They were legit playing 4v5 in this game. He did not exist. I cannot stress enough. This is probably the single worst game I've seen at the entire tournament. That includes Bin's worst games from the beginning as well. This was atrocious. And I do have criticisms with this draft as well. Shanks is once again on an assassin, and I get the idea. The LPL mid laners have looked really good at this tournament on assassins. You had, of course, Cream pulling out the Akali and the Yone yesterday. You had Shanks looking great on the Yone earlier on in this series, and so you want to keep that trend going, but you feel like something like LeBlanc maybe fits your comp a bit better. The big problem is, look at T1's comp. How are you ever supposed to play this game if you can't immediately kill Victor and Kai'Sa? Like, if you can't one-shot them? Shanks is basically saying, if I'm ever behind in gold on anyone in this game, it's over. I can't play. And he played these team fights super well. He was dodging in and out. He was maximizing his damage. He's clearly very comfortable on LeBlanc, but this champion just doesn't do enough. She is too limiting in terms of the way that her playstyle ends up playing for someone like Shanks to be able to carry a game on it. It needs to be an ancillary ancillary piece, and it just was not in this game. Tarzan had some great engages on Skarner, had some horrible engages on Skarner. Like, you can look at some of these plays and see one of the worst, Skarner engages, like whiffs in terms of ults you've ever seen in your life. And he also was overstepping at times. He ends up delaying his death at the end of the game, which basically cost them the entire game because they give over Baron and Dragon Soul for it. It's just a nightmare from Tarzan in terms of the minor things, but he had a couple of big moments. Flandre was huge in this game. He was basically unkillable throughout all of the mid game. I'm not a fan of Mordekaiser because I do think he eventually is almost always going to get outscaled, but boy, in the mid game did it look like it was going to work out for AL when it felt like they actually had a real chance of winning this. But at the end of the day, there are too many things going wrong here. LeBlanc is not strong enough, Tarzan is making too many mistakes, and you don't have an AD carry. There's no way to win that game, even against a weakened T1 side, and Guma was more than strong enough to carry them. But that sets it up now. Our first Silver Scrapes game number 5 of Worlds in 2025. Only one more game to decide the fate of both of these teams. Will T1 once again prove that the LPL cannot take them out at the World Championships and get themselves back to the semifinals, or will AL do what so many teams from their region have failed to achieve over the course of the past decade plus, and that's eliminate T1? Well, the winner of game number 5 was T1. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2. And some way, somehow, in this game where AL were up 6,000 gold, T1 are able to win. I want to try and sound like, I'm surprised. Like, what a big comeback. It's so big for T1. There's no surprise. There's no narrative here. There's no shock. There's no anything. This is just what happens, man. Like, there's nothing else left to talk about. Like, I'm going to go into this game, but if you're coming here to hear me be like, oh my God, T1, they're just insane. They did it again. Like, it was 6,000 gold up for AL, and I was sitting there just being like, they're going to lose. Like, it's just what happens. Like, this is how things go for T1 at Worlds against the LPL. It doesn't matter. The plot writers, the script writers for this Worlds are eminently lazy in terms of how they are writing things, because you cannot have Control-C, Control-V'd fast enough on this game in terms of how things have gone previously. Obviously, I'm making jokes because this was a ridiculous comeback from T1, and, AL should have won the game, and they didn't, and it happens all the time, but, credit to T1. They clearly are just better in these big moments than everybody else is, and that's really what separates them. They had a couple of terrible performances in this game. We're going to get to Oner, who I think tried his best to get himself eliminated from this tournament. Guy wants to go home, I guess, but outside of that, I think T1 played really well down the stretch. They really just executed better, and when you win a fight down 6,000 gold, even if it is off center and you've got the Aatrox getting caught and then the Sejuani going in by herself and losing all of her health, Hope not really being able to free hit on the backline as the Jinx, all of this stuff going down, yeah, that's a problem. If you're better in that fight as T1, that's still ridiculous, even with all of those things happening. So, credit to this team. I don't want to take away their accomplishment, just rather, you want me to be surprised? I'm not. It's just how things go. I'm not sitting here being like, oh, what a comeback. Of course they won this game. You're not allowed to be surprised anymore by this team doing this. It just kind of is who they are. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Gumayusi in the bot lane. I really didn't think of anyone else in terms of player of the series. Player of the game could definitely go to Faker here. And really, if you wanted to give player of the series to Faker, I can kind of understand because of game number 1 as well, where I do think he was excellent, but I think games 2 and 3 were just not effective enough for me to consider him for this. And, even if Guma really played a bad Ziggs game, I think he was a little bit better in their final 2 wins. So for me, Guma is going to get player of the series. I guess I'm just biased towards Guma now. I never thought I'd say that about a T1 player, but I really am just a huge fan of what this guy is doing. I think he was essential towards this victory. This was one of the best Ashe games you're ever going to see, coming off of a Kai'Sa game where he absolutely decimated Hope. For him to pull out Ashe here and, actively keep T1 in this game and then win them a couple of fights down the stretch. It's a massive performance from a player that, like I said, is becoming the face of T1 in terms of how this team plays. For me, as an analyst, he already is the face of T1. I get it. He'll never be that for a casual audience as long as Faker is here. But, the way that this team plays, my eye always goes to Guma first when I'm watching what T1 does. That's just where he's at. He is the star of this team. I think he's the best player on T1. Broadcast gave player of the series to Keria. Okay, interesting. It felt like a very weird choice for me. There's been a lot of weird choices for player of the series on broadcast. I honestly don't really understand, why you would give it to Carrier here. He was good. Like, he played well. I'm not trying to say he was bad or that he was negative. He was good for the team. He wasn't, like, the best player on the team. Like, that is, I think, a crazy thing to say in terms of how he performed. He was really good here today, and I think he played better than he has at this tournament up until this point. There were a couple of games in particular that I think he really ended up being really exemplary in. Even in their losses, I thought he had a lot of big positive moments, but player of the series is just a little bit insane with what Guma was able to do, and even really what Faker was capable of doing here, being able to secure the Otacon with the Mel execute, and then of course just taking over in some of these fights. But I'm gonna do the rare thing here, and I'm giving Dud of the game to somebody who actually won the game and the series here. I'm giving it to Oner in the jungle. Again, he tried his best to go home early on this Dr. Mundo. I said this in the G2 series recap yesterday, but this is not some sort of Omega broken pick. Like, I think Mundo is strong, but I think it's perfect for G2 in terms of how they like to play the game and also what Skewmond is as a player. I think Mundo kind of plays into everything G2 want to operate with. T1 pull it out here in one of the most important situations, and Oner is paper this game. I mean, truly, this guy was useless. He did literally nothing. The only thing that I will give Oner credit for is that he consistently was able to outsmite Tarzan. Specifically, he was able to take the soul away from Tarzan on a 50-50. And that's massive. Like, that is a game-sealing type of move from Oner, but, like, in team fights, this Mundo was doing nothing. Like, certainly was the least relevant champion in the entire game. He was literally just, again, walking up and dying first. Oner did not look comfortable at all. I do not want to see this pick from T1 throughout the rest of this World Championships. To pull this out in game number 5, it's clear he wasn't even comfortable on it. It's just a ridiculous choice, and Oner almost went home because of it. But, Doran also, I think, struggled to find any sort of avenue. Flandre was massive in this series and in this game for AL, and, the top side wasn't exactly strong enough, but it just came down to one fight. Again, up 6k gold, the Flandre's Aatrox gets caught once, and then all of a sudden Tarzan goes in, loses all of its health, loses all of his health, and T1 is able to take the fight. Gold lead is gone. Elder, Baron, etc., game over. So credit to T1 for their perseverance and for continuing their legacy of defeating the LPL. And for AL on the other side, come on, man. Like, you know what I mean? Why even get the hopes up if you're just gonna do what everybody else has done and lose to T1 anyways? This team was up 2-1 in this series. They had a 6,000 gold lead in game 5, and somehow they walk out of this as losers. Just is what it is. Hope was too bad in game number 4. He was a little bit more relevant, I would say, here in game 5, if only because the Jinx was quite strong in the early game, but boy, was that champion not doing nearly enough in the late game. Part of that is the setup. Part of that is that Hope was playing so passive. I just do not think Hope lived up to his breakout year. This was the best year of his entire career by far, and I think he regressed back to what he has been throughout every other part of his career at Worlds, and that is single-handedly the worst possible time for that to happen. Just disappointing there. I thought Kyle was solid enough on the Lulu, did make it quite difficult to deal with the Aatrox and even the Jinx throughout a lot of this mid-game. Tarzan survived some bad scenarios because of that Lulu ultimate throughout multiple points, but Tarzan also just didn't have a very good game on the Sejuani. He carried game number 3, and I was like, okay, great, we're finally getting that Tarzan that was doing really well. He just wasn't good enough. Again, like, I don't think Oner was very good, but that doesn't mean that Tarzan was good on the other side. He still lost the 50-50 smite for Soul, and why are we 50-50ing it? Like, this lead was well generated, but I think Tarzan needed to be more aggressive in this game with that lead than he was, and he just wasn't. The disconnect in that final fight is what ended up costing them. Flandre had a phenomenal series. I think he was probably the best player for AL throughout the series. It just didn't really matter. He gets caught in the most important moment, and that loses them the game. Shanks was actually very good here on the Syndra, and maybe Shanks was actually the best player for AL in this series, but he didn't have the agency. It's not like he was on a Yone or an Akali where he could 1v9 the game. He was on Syndra, and he was doing a great job of being able to output damage on that champion, but it just wasn't meant to be. AL, with their huge gold lead, with their, fantastic play, just crumble when it matters the most, and that's where T1 thrive as a team. Unfortunately for Anyone's Legend as an organization, they probably hoped to get past the quarterfinals, but honestly, I think this is still a pretty okay outcome. I had this team number 6 in my power rankings coming into the tournament. A quarterfinals loss would have been entirely appropriate, and losing to T1 is certainly nothing to be ashamed of at the World Championships, especially for an org that had never had any success before 2025. All of these players were counted out in many other years, and while the expectation had risen a lot, the responsibility of this team and this org had risen a lot. they still are, very new to the upper echelons of Worlds. For them to make quarterfinals for the first time as an organization and to take T1 to 5 games, be a team that could very easily have made the semis and likely even had a chance to make the finals, like, that is a very successful year for an Anyone's Legend organization that has very rarely found that level of success, never found that level of success before. And everything they did before this, they were champions in the LPL. They went to the finals of international tournaments, right? Like, this was a phenomenal team. They have nothing to be ashamed of across the year of 2025, but it is T1 who has locked back in. Their World's form is still not entirely here. There are many things that I think they do need to go out and fix and figure out and get more comfortable at, but at this point, how can I not bet on this team to just take it all the way again? Like, it's just who they are. It seems inevitable at this point. This is the best year T1 has had in years, and they've consistently been winning Worlds anyways. This is a team that absolutely has the potential to just run the rest of this tournament, and it's pretty much all in their hands now. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2025 Worlds Quarterfinals Day number 4 overview and analysis video. That is every quarterfinals matchup done and dusted, wrapped up here. We know our 4 semifinalists at this point, the top 4 teams in the world at this tournament, 3 LCK teams and an LPL team, just as we all could have anticipated. Maybe not the teams we expected, but certainly, I think the overall distribution that this year has indicated these two regions have held. But what exactly do we think of these matchups? Usually I would want to make a separate video on the semifinals like I did for the quarterfinals, previewing it, but again, with there being no break, I don't want to double upload today and screw myself in the algorithm, so I'm just going to tack it on and add it on towards the end of this video, and that means we're previewing them right now. I'm not going to go as in-depth as maybe I did in the quarterfinals, because a lot of the things I said there very much still stand. There weren't really upsets in the quarterfinals. Basically, everything that happened there was anticipated. The only outcome I didn't predict was technically KT, who I give a higher chance of winning to. So overall, not surprised by that, but we can go over how they match up specifically against each other, starting with the one we're getting tonight, the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen G, taking on the number 3 seed from the LCK in KT Rolster. Of course, Gen G are favorites going into this. If you need a reminder, that little bar in the middle that is different colors, black and white, in this case kind of indicates how favorable I think one team is over the other. Think of it as a percentage bar or like an odds bar, if you will, in the middle of the screen to kind of indicate who I think is favorited. Gen G are absolutely big favorites coming into this series. KT Rolster are very, very happy to be top 4 in the world, to make the semifinals for the first time in this organization's history, but they are major underdogs going into a Gen G team that has just looked so dominant all year long. Now, the main thing to note here, the main narrative, the main storyline, KT is the only team in the world to have beaten Gen G in a best of 5 since the beginning of Spring Split. They are the only team. Nobody else has been able to beat Gen G. KT was the team in playoffs to take down this Gen G team and put them down into lower bracket, make them go on that big run. Now, we're not going to bring up the fact that in the lower bracket finals of that same tournament, Gen G absolutely obliterated KT Rolster 3-0 in 3 of the least competitive games you've ever seen in your entire life. But we have seen that KT is one of the few teams with the rare upside to be able to beat Gen G if they're playing poorly, but it's just so hard to imagine that that's going to be the case. I'm done doubting KT Rolster in the sense that I do believe they are a top 5 team in the world and that the LCK really is just that strong. But Gen G's on a different level. Like, Gen G are the kings of the LCK for a reason. They should be favorited here. Keen is absolutely better than Perfect. As good as Perfect has been at this tournament, Keen has been even better for Gen G, and I think that will be a bit of a problem. Canyon is somebody who I believe in. Maybe you think Cuz can get advantages. I think he's been phenomenal at Worlds. Cuz has had a really good tournament. Maybe he is able to pick up a game win just from the early games that he's able to generate, and his late game team fights have been really consistent, but I think Canyon is more stable. We'll get to the mid lane in a second. Ruler versus Dekdom is disgustingly not close. I think Dekdom's been excellent so far at Worlds, but Ruler is the best AD carry in the world. And then Duro and Peter have both been really important pieces. Peter, for me, was MVP of the quarterfinals, and Duro, to me, was a very similar kind of impact for his team. I think if one of these players is infinitely better, which I expect to be Duro, then I imagine that team will win. But you do have Chovy versus BDD, and when you're talking about things that went right for KT Rolster in their winning series, it was Cuz and BDD actually being able to separate themselves from Canyon and Chovy in that series that they won. Now, in the rematch, Chovy obliterated BDD in the lower bracket finals, made it very uncompetitive, but if they can get a similar impact out of this jungle mid duo, things can happen for KT Rolster. I don't think it's impossible. I'm giving Gen G about an 85% chance to win. I would say it's 85-15 for me. They are major favorites going into this series. series, and if they lose, it's a massive upset, and KT being in the finals for the first time ever would be insane with this roster, but it's not impossible. They are one of the few teams that actually does have a visual win over Gen.G on stage, but that's the first quarterfinals matchup. We can go ahead and preview the second one. This might be even quicker because we just talked about one of these teams for the entirety of this video, but it's the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports taking on the number 4 seed from the LCK in T1. Obviously, T1 are coming into this as favorites. I don't think anybody is going to be looking at that in any other way. I think Top Esports is probably weaker than AL, although I think it's debatably, there. Like, I think that there is a world where Top Esports could win this, and I do think that this is the less lopsided on paper of the 2 series, but it's T1 versus the LPL. It's Top Esports in a big moment, and I already assume that T1 is more talented. They're definitely going to be favorites here. I would say about 70-30 in favor of T1. Maybe 65-35 if you really want to be generous towards TES. I do think they have a shot of winning this series. It wouldn't be the biggest upset of all time or anything if TES ended up winning this, but I certainly think that they are underdogs, and I think the reason for that is I just don't believe that their talent matches up well into T1. Kanavi would have to have an unbelievable series, which he is capable of having. I think Kanavi has been great at Worlds up until this point. I think he's been a huge point of success for this team, and his early games have been as advertised, but Oner is really good at being able to stall games out. Now, the big concern for me, T1's early games have really not been good at this tournament or domestically. If Top Esports is going to win this series, it's going to be off the back of the fact that they are just faster and more aggressive than T1. But on the flip side, like, Top Esports are not good in the late game, and even when they do generate leads, sometimes they are, more willing to throw that lead away than maybe you would want to see out of a team that's trying to win the World Championships. And so that's kind of the overall matchup, but I think that really plays into the jungle here with Kanavi versus Oner, where if Kanavi can get those 1.5K gold leads that he's kind of accustomed to so far in the jungle at this tournament, I think things are going to be just fine for TES, and they actually have a real chance of being able to win this series. But if anything else happens, like if they even go neutral, I would very much favor Oner in that jungle matchup. On the top side, 369 and Doran, I very favor 369 here. He's been great at this tournament so far. I think he will continue to be great, but I just don't know if it matters. Doran is such a good team fighter that even losing in lane isn't something that really ends up affecting him. You have Cream versus Faker in this matchup, and unfortunately for Cream, as well as he played in that previous series, I don't know if he's going to be able to repeat that. We'll see if T1 wants to continue to give Faker things that are immobile against players that are very good at playing melee assassins like they did in this previous series, but at least for now, Faker definitely going to be favored in that mid lane matchup. And then support, Hong versus Keria. This is another big feather in the cap of T1. Hong has just not really been there. He is not really a top 4 caliber player in the world, as a world semifinals caliber player, and he's here because the rest of the team is good enough to be able to get him here. Keria is absolutely better, and I imagine will be better in this upcoming series, but it's going to come down to AD carry for me. JackeyLove's last stand versus the player for me in Gumayusi that has been the most important for T1. If one of these AD carries is accelerated and one of them just plays better than their opposition, I really imagine that that's probably going to be the end of this entire tournament for whoever isn't able to get going. If JackeyLove can really pop off and be that guy, like we know he can be the former world champion that JackeyLove is, it's possible for Top Esports to win here, man. Like Kanavi, JackeyLove, even someone like Cream or 369. I could see a world where they are good enough to be player of the series in a win over T1 in the semifinals, but you gotta favor T1, man, especially with what just happened to AL. That team, I think, is more consistent than Top Esports in terms of their execution, even if TES was better domestically. And I think the matchup was better for AL. I think a lot is going to need to go right, and T1 are definitely going to be favorites in this series for that reason. That means I'm anticipating a T1 Gen.G finals, a Chovy versus Faker World finals, and if we do get that, how exciting could that possibly be? That would be so entertaining. But that's going to do it for today's video. You can see the bracket up on the screen. Let me know what your thoughts on these semifinals matchups are, who you think is going to win, and who you think is maybe being talked about in a wrong way. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Like I said, we're gonna be covering the semifinals daily as we've done for every single game at this tournament, and then of course the finals. After that, the offseason is rolling already, especially in the LEC, but even in the LCS now, we're already starting to get a lot of really big news, and that's gonna be covered on this channel after Worlds ends. If you want, a comprehensive overview of everything in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all